The truth comes out. The night air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of a revelation that had the power to change everything. Judge Donovan Hayes stood beside his car, arms crossed, his face unreadable as Officer Catherine Blake's entire world began to shift. Just moments ago, she had been in control. She had smirked, mocked, and dismissed the man standing in front of her. She had assumed he was just another black man driving a car that didn't belong to him, another suspect to be handled. But now that illusion was crumbling, because this wasn't just a man, this was Judge Donovan Hayes. And the moment Officer Derek Foster spoke his name aloud, Blake's confidence shattered. The shift in power, Blake's fingers twitched as if grasping for an explanation, some justification for what she had just done. She turned to Foster, her eyes narrowing. "What did you just say?" Foster didn't answer right away. His hesitation spoke volumes. His jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff. He had walked into this scene expecting a routine stop, a backup call that would amount to nothing more than paperwork. Instead, he had found a disaster. He had found a federal judge being treated like a criminal. And worse, it had all been caught on camera. Blake's expression flickered from confusion to something more dangerous, defensiveness. Her grip on her belt tightened. She wasn't ready to admit she was wrong. Not yet. The moment of recognition, Blake turned back to Donovan, really looking at him for the first time. She had ignored the way he carried himself, the controlled authority in his voice, the way he had refused to panic even as she escalated the situation. And now she could see it, the recognition, the fear creeping in. She had detained a man who had the power to ruin her career with a single phone call. And she knew it. The denial begins. Blake swallowed, her stance shifting. This was the moment where she could have admitted fault. She could have stepped back, apologized, walked away with her dignity somewhat intact. But instead, she doubled down. "That doesn't change anything," she muttered, shaking her head. "He was acting suspiciously." Donovan exhaled slowly, shaking his head. There it was. Even when faced with the truth, some people refused to acknowledge it. Suspicious how? His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. By existing, by driving home? Blake's lips pressed together in a thin line. Foster stepped in now, his voice lower, urgent. "Catherine, you need to stop." She turned to him, her nostrils flaring. "What? Are you seriously telling me that this," she gestured toward Donovan, "means we just let him go?" Foster's eyes widened in disbelief. She still didn't get it. "We never should have stopped him in the first place," Foster snapped. Blake opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her breath came faster now, her mind racing, trying to grasp onto anything that would justify her actions. She was drowning, and she knew it. The bystanders' footage then, another voice cut through the tension. "The whole world is gonna see this." Blake's head snapped toward the sidewalk. The bystander who had been filming the entire time stood just a few feet away, his phone still raised. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't afraid, because he knew what he had, the evidence, the proof that Officer Catherine Blake had crossed a line she could never uncross. Blake's face paled. She had seen this happen before to other officers, to colleagues whose names became headlines overnight. She had laughed at them, sworn that she would never be so careless, so reckless. And yet, here she was, a viral moment waiting to happen, a desperate attempt to regain control. Blake straightened her spine, forcing herself to hold on to some semblance of authority. She turned to Donovan. "You're free to go." The words felt like acid in her mouth. But Donovan didn't move. He wasn't finished. He met her gaze, unflinching. "You owe me an apology." Blake's mouth pressed into a hard line. Her pride fought against the demand, against the truth that she had been wrong. And in that moment, she had a choice. Admit she had made a mistake, or walk away, pretending it never happened. She chose the latter. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed toward her patrol car. But as she walked away, Donovan knew that her problems were just beginning. Because while she might have been able to walk away from him, she wouldn't be able to walk away from the consequences. The beginning of the end Foster lingered, clearly uncomfortable. He hesitated before speaking. "Judge Hayes." Donovan held up a hand. "Save it." Foster nodded, ashamed, because he knew. He had stood by and watched it happen. He had let it happen. And now he would have to live with that. Donovan took his license back, sliding it into his wallet. He turned to the young man with the camera. "Make sure that video gets seen." The man nodded. "Oh, don't worry, it will." Donovan inhaled deeply, looking one last time at Officer Catherine Blake, sitting in her patrol car, her hands clenched into fists around the steering wheel. She thought she had won, but by morning, the world would see exactly what she had done, and there would be no escaping the truth. The bystanders' footage goes viral. The night was meant to end in silence, with Officer Catherine Blake retreating into the darkness, convinced that her unchecked authority had won yet again. She had humiliated Judge Donovan Hayes, mocked him, dismissed his credentials, and treated him like nothing more than a suspect with an expensive car. She had walked away without an apology, without an ounce of regret. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have predicted, was that her actions had already left her grasp. Because someone else had seen everything, and someone else had captured it all. Standing just a few feet away, phone still raised, was a young black man who had filmed the entire stop. His hands had been steady, his focus had been sharp, he knew exactly what he was doing. The moment Blake had pulled Donovan from his vehicle, her hand hovering over her holster, the sneer on her lips, unmistakable, he had hit a chord. At first, he had only planned to watch, but then he saw something different. A federal judge, a man who upheld the law, a man whose decisions had shaped the very system Blake claimed to serve, was being treated as if his life meant nothing. And that wasn't something he could ignore. From a single clip to millions, the bystander didn't wait. He didn't need to edit the footage. He didn't need to add dramatic captions or heavy filters. The video spoke for itself. Blake's laughter as she dismissed Donovan's title, her refusal to acknowledge she had made a mistake, even when Officer Derek Foster tried to intervene. The moment her face fell as she realized who she had just mocked and mistreated, every second was damning. And within moments, it was online. First to Twitter, then to Instagram, then to Facebook. He uploaded it before he even left the scene. By the time Donovan was home, his phone was already vibrating with messages. By the time the sun rose, the world had seen it. The internet reacts. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A sitting judge was just racially profiled and humiliated by a cop, and she laughed at him. Imagine what happens to everyday people if this can happen to a federal judge. This is why we demand accountability. This is why we record. The outrage was not just from activists and civil rights groups, it was from everyone. People who had never spoken about police misconduct were suddenly engaged, because this wasn't just about Donovan. This was about every black man who had been stopped for looking suspicious. This was about every person who had been dismissed, laughed at, disrespected because their identity didn't match the power they held. This time, the world had proof. The media picks up the story. By mid-morning, major news outlets had taken notice. CNN was running the footage on repeat. The New York Times published an article, "A Federal Judge's Run-In with Racial Profiling Goes Viral." Even conservative networks, hesitant to criticize law enforcement, were forced to address the undeniable facts. But no matter how the media tried to spin it, the footage spoke for itself. There was no editing, no room for interpretation, no misunderstanding that could justify Blake's actions. Millions had seen the moment her face changed when she realized her mistake. And no matter what she said now, that moment could never be undone. Public outrage turns into action. The calls began pouring in almost immediately. Emails flooded the police department's inbox. Phone lines crashed from the sheer volume of complaints. The demands were clear: fire Catherine Blake now. If a judge can't be safe, what chance do the rest of us have? What's the department doing about this? Protests were planned outside the precinct. Petitions began circulating. The public wasn't going to let this go. By noon, a press conference had been scheduled, and Officer Catherine Blake's name was no longer just a badge number. She was the face of a national controversy. Blake's reality comes crashing down. Blake had started her shift that morning like any other. She had walked into the precinct, her routine unchanged. But the moment she stepped through the doors, she knew something was wrong. Colleagues whispered in the halls. Some avoided eye contact. Others gave her pointed glances. By the time she reached her desk, her phone was blowing up. 20 missed calls, hundreds of messages on social media. Her personal accounts flooded with outrage. Then she was summoned. Chief Jonathan Calloway wanted to see her, and from the look on his face, she wasn't going to like what he had to say. A career in freefall, Blake sat stiffly in the chair across from Calloway's desk, her hands clenched in her lap as he stared at the screen of his phone. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then he exhaled sharply, set the phone down, and looked at her with undisguised disappointment. "What the hell were you thinking, Catherine?" Blake opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She had thought this was just another routine stop. She had thought she had gotten away with worse. But now, she was looking at the reality of her actions, and there was no escaping it. The camera had caught everything, and now the world was demanding justice. The press conference, the beginning of the end. By 3:00 p.m., the department's press conference was broadcasted nationwide. The chief's words were careful, but the message was clear. The department had launched an internal investigation. Blake had been placed on immediate suspension. Further disciplinary actions were under review, but the public wanted more. The protests outside the precinct grew larger. The pressure mounted. Blake's face, her name, her career were now headlines. She had been so sure of herself when she laughed at Judge Hayes, but now the world had seen who she really was, and there was no escaping the truth. The public demands justice. As dawn broke over Atlanta, the city was already buzzing, not with the usual hum of morning commuters, but with the mounting roar of public outrage. The viral video of Judge Donovan Hayes' wrongful detainment had ignited a firestorm, spreading across the internet like wildfire. In less than 24 hours, millions had watched as Officer Catherine Blake smirked, mocked, and humiliated a federal judge simply because she refused to believe that a black man could hold such power. This wasn't just another case of police misconduct. This was a moment of reckoning, and the people weren't going to let it go. Social media erupts. It started with a single video clip, but by morning, the internet had transformed it into a national crisis. If this can happen to a federal judge, what happens to the rest of us? She didn't just racially profile him, she laughed at him. Let that sink in. Accountability isn't optional. Fire Catherine Blake now. Celebrities, activists, and politicians all joined the conversation. A well-known civil rights attorney tweeted, "Officer Blake didn't just abuse her power, she put the entire justice system on trial. And we will not stay silent." A former senator posted, "Every American deserves dignity and respect." This video proves we still have a long way to go. A famous actor shared the clip with a simple caption, "Unacceptable. Do better, America." The pressure was mounting, and it wasn't just online. Calls flood the police department. By mid-morning, the Atlanta Police Department's phone lines were completely overwhelmed. Thousands of people called demanding immediate action. Emails and official complaints poured in from across the country. Local news stations reported that the department had received more public outrage in one day than in any previous case of police misconduct. Inside the precinct, officers exchanged nervous glances. Some of them had worked alongside Blake for years, but now they weren't defending her. Others had stayed silent in past cases of misconduct, but this was different. Some officers even whispered, "She should have known better," and at the highest levels of leadership, there was panic. Because this wasn't just an internal issue anymore, the whole world was watching. Protests take over Atlanta by noon. Crowds had begun to gather in front of the Atlanta police headquarters. Hundreds turned into thousands. Community leaders and activists stood shoulder to shoulder, chanting for justice. Protesters held signs that read, "Fire Blake now, no more racial profiling, justice for Judge Hayes." And as news helicopters circled overhead, the world saw that this was not just another protest. This was a demand for accountability, a demand for justice, a demand for real, lasting change. As one protester told a news reporter, "We're not just here for Judge Hayes. We're here for every black man who never had a camera on them." The department could no longer ignore the pressure. And so at exactly 3:00 p.m. they called a press conference. Blake's world comes crashing down. Inside the precinct, Officer Catherine Blake sat frozen at her desk, her heart pounding. She had started her day thinking this would blow over. She had assumed people would forget just like they always did. She had been wrong. Now, her name was plastered across every news outlet. Her personal accounts had been deleted after being flooded with messages. Her phone had been ringing non-stop, but she was too afraid to answer. Even her fellow officers wouldn't look her in the eye. Then her supervisor approached. "Chief Calloway wants to see you." Now, Blake's stomach dropped. She stood, smoothing down her uniform, trying to maintain her composure. She told herself she had done nothing wrong, but deep down, she knew the truth. This was the beginning of the end. The press conference, the moment of truth. By the time Chief Jonathan Calloway stepped onto the podium, the entire country was watching. News stations broadcasted the event live. Thousands of people gathered outside the station, waiting for answers. Reporters had their microphones ready, knowing this was going to be a defining moment. The chief took a deep breath, then spoke. "We are aware of the viral video involving Officer Catherine Blake and Judge Donovan Hayes. We recognize the public concern regarding this incident. Effective immediately, Officer Blake has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." The crowd erupted. Some cheered, but many were still furious. Reporters shouted questions, demanding to know if Blake would be fired. Protesters chanted louder, refusing to accept a temporary suspension as real justice. But one thing was clear: this was no longer just a police department issue. This was a national conversation about power, accountability, and systemic change. Justice is only beginning inside the station. Blake sat in silence, staring at her hands. Her badge was still on her chest, but she knew it might not be for long. Her career was no longer under her control. She was no longer just an officer, she was a symbol of what was wrong. As she heard the continued chants outside the building, she finally understood. This time, there would be no quiet resolution. This time, she couldn't just walk away. This time, the people weren't going to forget. And for the first time since that night, she felt something she never expected: fear. Because justice, it was coming for her. Chief Jonathan Calloway intervenes. The moment Chief Jonathan Calloway stepped into his office that morning, he knew his department was in crisis. The walls of the Atlanta police headquarters seemed to hum with tension. Officers whispered in the hallways. Senior officials huddled together in closed-door meetings. The entire precinct had been consumed by a single name: Officer Catherine Blake. The video of her mocking and detaining Judge Donovan Hayes had exploded across social media overnight. Millions of views, national headlines. Protests swelling outside the station. It was no longer just an internal matter. It was a public scandal. And now, everyone was looking at him, waiting to see what he would do. The weight of leadership. Calloway had been in law enforcement for nearly 3 decades. He had seen his fair share of controversies, but nothing like this. This wasn't a civilian accusing an officer of misconduct. This wasn't a he said, she said situation. This was a federal judge, one of the most respected legal minds in the country, who had been stopped, harassed and humiliated, on camera with the entire world watching, and now his department was in freefall. Public trust was crumbling. Political leaders were demanding action. Even some of his own officers were uncomfortable defending Blake's behavior. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about the reputation of the entire force. And if he didn't act fast, it would never recover. The meeting that changed everything. Calloway sat behind his desk, his jaw clenched as he scrolled through the endless stream of headlines. Officer faces backlash for racially profiling federal judge. Atlanta Police Department under fire after viral traffic stop. Protesters demand justice. Will the chief take action? His office door opened. An officer entered, her face tense. "Chief, she's here." Calloway took a deep breath. Send her in. The confrontation with Catherine Blake. The moment Catherine Blake stepped inside, Calloway could see the cracks in her confidence. Her uniform was still neatly pressed, but her posture was rigid. Her face was tight, her eyes flickering with unease. She had started the day thinking she could walk away from this. Now, she wasn't so sure. She had seen the news. She had heard the chants from the protesters outside. She knew her name was now a symbol of everything wrong with modern policing. She sat stiffly in the chair across from him, hands folded in her lap. Calloway studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "Tell me, Catherine, what the hell were you thinking?" Blake tries to justify herself. Blake straightened her shoulders, her jaw tightening. "I was following protocol. He was being uncooperative. I had reason to believe he was lying." Calloway scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You thought a sitting federal judge was lying?" Blake swallowed hard. "Sir, with all due respect, he was acting suspiciously." "Wrong answer." Calloway exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Catherine, do you realize what you've done? You didn't just detain an innocent man. You didn't just violate department policy. You embarrassed this entire force on a national level." Blake's face burned red. "I didn't mean..." Calloway cut her off with a sharp glare. "Meaning doesn't matter. Actions do." The moment of reckoning. Calloway stood, placing both hands on his desk. "You treated a judge, the kind of person who has the power to rule on cases against officers like you, as if he was beneath you." You laughed in his face. "And now, the world has seen exactly who you are." Blake opened her mouth again, but Calloway held up a hand. "Don't. Just don't." She clenched her fists, looking away. For the first time, she had nothing to say. She couldn't explain it away. She couldn't control the narrative anymore. She couldn't erase the evidence. Calloway sat back down, shaking his head. "Catherine Blake, effective immediately. You are suspended without pay pending an internal investigation." Blake's head snapped up. "Suspended?" she echoed, as if she had expected a slap on the wrist. "You're lucky it's not worse. I want your badge and your gun on my desk now." Blake hesitated. "Sir, if you just let me now." Slowly, reluctantly, she removed her badge and service weapon, placing them on his desk. Her hands were shaking. She knew what this meant. This wasn't just suspension. This was the beginning of the end. The press conference. The public demands more hours later, as Calloway stood behind a podium, facing a sea of reporters and cameras. He knew his words had to be measured but firm. "We are aware of the viral video involving Officer Catherine Blake and Judge Donovan Hayes. The Atlanta Police Department holds its officers to the highest standards. Effective immediately, Officer Blake has been suspended pending a full internal investigation. The press erupted with questions. Will she be fired? Is the department taking responsibility for this incident? Does this reflect a larger issue within law enforcement? Calloway remained composed, but he could feel the weight of the moment. We will conduct a full review, and if necessary, further disciplinary action will be taken. The citizens of Atlanta deserve accountability. We will not tolerate misconduct. But even as he spoke, he knew the public wouldn't settle for just a suspension. They wanted more, and Catherine Blake's career was hanging by a thread. The beginning of the end. As Calloway walked back inside the station, officers whispered around him. He passed by Catherine Blake, still sitting at her desk, her uniform gone, replaced by civilian clothes. Her head was down, her hands were folded, her career was slipping through her fingers. Calloway stopped, just for a moment. Then he shook his head and walked away, because justice was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The consequences for Officer Catherine Blake. The weight of her actions came crashing down faster than she had ever anticipated. Just 24 hours ago, she had been a confident officer, patrolling the streets with an air of unchecked authority, believing herself to be untouchable. Now she sat in the cold, sterile walls of an administrative office, her hands clenched into tight fists, her mind racing. Her badge was gone, her gun turned in, her career hanging by a thread. A career in freefall. The morning after the video went viral, Blake walked into the precinct, thinking she could still salvage the situation. She had convinced herself that this would blow over, that maybe it would be an internal slap on the wrist, that her department would protect her, like they always had. But as soon as she stepped through the doors, she knew everything had changed. Colleagues whispered behind her back. Some officers avoided eye contact altogether. Others shook their heads, muttering words like, "should have known better." Her name wasn't just a badge number anymore, it was a headline. She had gone viral, and not in the way anyone wanted. Her stomach tightened as she walked past a TV screen in the break room, where news anchors dissected the situation, playing the video over and over again. The officer laughed in the face of a federal judge. This is exactly why people don't trust law enforcement. Calls for termination grow as protests continue outside APD headquarters. She swallowed hard. She had heard stories of other officers getting caught in scandals. She had never imagined she'd be one of them. A meeting she couldn't escape. Just as she reached her desk, a fellow officer approached. "Chief Calloway wants to see you." Now her heart pounded. This was it. She walked down the hallway, the walls suddenly feeling too tight, too suffocating. With every step, the weight on her shoulders grew heavier. She knew this wasn't going to end in her favor. She knew she had lost control. She entered Calloway's office and found him sitting behind his desk, a hard expression on his face. On his computer screen, the video playing again and again. Blake tries to defend herself. She opened her mouth, trying to find an excuse. Any excuse, but before she could say a word, Calloway held up a hand. "Don't!" His voice was clipped, his patience already gone. "Catherine, do you understand what you've done?" She sat up straighter. "Sir, one was just doing my job." Calloway slammed his fist onto his desk. "Doing your job?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. "You detained and humiliated a federal judge. You mocked him. You refused to believe him. And now? Now you've made this entire department look like a disgrace." Blake flinched. She had expected frustration, but not this level of fury. "The decision is made." Calloway leaned forward, his voice low, controlled. "Catherine Blake, effective immediately. You are placed on unpaid suspension, pending an internal investigation." Blake froze. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This wasn't just a warning. This was the beginning of the end. She stammered, "Sir, if you could just," Calloway cut her off. "Hand over your department ID, now." Her hands trembled as she reached into her pocket, pulling out her ID badge. The same badge she had once worn with pride. The same badge that had given her the power she had so easily abused. Now, it was being taken from her. She placed it on his desk, her fingers hesitating for just a moment. It was over. The final blow as she walked out of Calloway's office. The entire precinct felt different. She wasn't an officer anymore. She wasn't protected anymore. She wasn't in control anymore. She was just another disgraced cop waiting for the inevitable. As she made her way to the parking lot, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Her hands shook as she answered. "Catherine Blake?" "Yes?" "You've been served." Her breath hitched. A lawsuit from Judge Donovan Hayes. And this time, there was no escaping justice. Judge Donovan Hayes reflects on the bigger issue. As Judge Donovan Hayes sat in his study that evening, the weight of the past 24 hours pressed down on him. The events of the night before played over in his mind, the flashing red and blue lights, the sharp commands, the mockery in Officer Catherine Blake's voice as she dismissed his identity without a second thought. Even though justice was finally being served, something about it all still sat uncomfortably within him. Because this wasn't just about him. More than one incident, Donovan had spent his entire career upholding the law, ensuring fairness in the system, ruling on cases where people, many who looked just like him, had been unfairly treated by law enforcement. He had read the case files. He had seen the evidence. He had heard the testimonies of men and women who had lived through encounters just like his. But until now, he had never been on the other side. He had never felt the weight of a badge misused against him. Never had he been forced to prove his worth in real time. Never had he been laughed at for simply existing in a way that challenged an officer's assumptions. And that was what unsettled him the most. Because if this could happen to him, an educated, accomplished federal judge, then what hope was there for the young men who didn't have his title to protect them? The reality of racial profiling. The truth was, his position had saved him. The moment Officer Derek Foster realized who he was, the energy shifted. The moment Blake understood her mistake, the situation de-escalated. The moment the world saw the footage, people demanded justice. But what if he hadn't been a judge? What if he had been just another man driving home late at night? What if there had been no bystander recording? What if there had been no social media outrage? Would anyone have believed him? Would anyone have cared? A system that needs to change. Donovan had always believed in the law. But laws mean nothing if the people enforcing them are not held accountable. How many times had stories like his gone unheard? How many people had been detained, arrested, or worse, because no one had questioned the officer's actions? How many careers, lives, and futures had been destroyed because the system allowed it? Blake's suspension was a start, but it wasn't enough. The problem wasn't just one officer. It was a system that allowed officers like her to exist without consequence. And as long as that system remained in place, this would keep happening to someone else, to someone without power, to someone without a title to protect them. And next time, the world might not be watching. A call for action as Donovan sat back in his chair. He knew that he couldn't just let this go. He would push for deeper investigations into racial profiling in law enforcement. He would use his platform to demand better training, better oversight, and real accountability. He would fight to ensure that no one judge or not ever had to experience what he did. Because justice isn't real until it applies to everyone, and Donovan Hayes was ready to make sure that happened. The power of justice and accountability. Life has a way of teaching us lessons, often in ways we least expect. Judge Donovan Hayes never imagined that someone who had spent decades upholding the law would one day become a victim of its flaws. But his story is not just about one man's experience. It is a reflection of a deeper issue that affects countless lives. At its core, this is a story about power, prejudice, and accountability. Power is meant to protect, not oppress. Authority is not a right to dominate others, but a responsibility to serve with fairness and dignity. When those in power misuse it, society must step in to demand justice. Prejudice blinds even the most trained eyes. Officer Catherine Blake didn't see a judge, she saw only her own assumptions. Too often, people are judged not by their actions but by stereotypes. This is why we must always challenge our own biases. Accountability is the foundation of a just society. If Judge Hayes hadn't been a man of influence, would his story have ended the same way? Too many others experience injustice without cameras to record it or voices to amplify their pain. True justice is not just about fixing one case, it's about changing the system for everyone. This is why we must never stay silent when we see injustice. Whether it's in our communities, in politics, or in the treatment of others, we have the power to demand change. Let's stand together for fairness, dignity, and real accountability. If you believe in justice, make your voice heard, like and share this video to spread awareness. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Comment below, what do you think needs to change in the justice system? Together, we can build a world where power is used to protect, not to oppress,